Today on Basic Bytes, we are peeking inside the much maligned MPS-802 printer for the Commodore 64, which is also known to masquerade as the 1526 in the VIC-20 circle. This is arguably the most misunderstood dot matrix printer ever released by Commodore, but makes for a worthy workhorse when employed according to its strengths. Today, we're going to talk all about it as I rebuild this fine unit right before your eyes. Welcome to Basic Bytes. I am your host, JC, and today we are peeking inside the Commodore MPS-802 dot matrix printer. This is the first time we are peeking inside hardware on this channel, and my intention is not to have it only aimed at the electronics experts, but rather that it will be of interest to the general Commodore 64 users / enthusiasts / hobbyists who are the intended audience of Basic Bytes. In fact, you won't even see me disassemble, repair, and refurbish this printer. Rather, what I'm going to do once we get into the internals is simply rebuild it for you layer by layer, and as we get to each subsequent layer, I will stop to talk about things that I think will be interesting or useful for the average user of one of these units to know, which hopefully will also bear some interest for the electronics crowd as well. And that way, if you aren't particularly interested in one of the components of this printer, you can simply skip ahead in the video to the next layer. By all means, leave me a comment to let me know what you think of this format. You've also already heard me mention that this MPS-802 is effectively the same printer as the 1526, and indeed it is. However, the differences, subtle though they are, do go beyond a simple difference in badge. I will be commenting on what those subtle differences are as we go through this video, and there is a reason why I'm qualified to do so. It just so happens that I have a 1526 sitting here as well, and this brief cameo will be its only appearance in today's video. This is, in fact, a non-functioning unit which I purchased at a deep discount, and with the assistance of the 802/1526 service manual and a multimeter, I determined that it does, in fact, have a faulty paper advance motor. But that's fine, because its purpose in life is now to be an organ donor to ensure that my 802 continues to function correctly into the future. But while we have it here, note that in addition to the different badge in front, the top cover sports this flat plateau styling to it, and that is meant to synchronize with the similar styling of the VIC-1525 printer, whereas the 802, that is the star of our show today, has the sleeker slope to its cover, meant of course to synchronize with the styling of the 801. However, given that the 802 styling was the one specifically intended for pairing with the Commodore 64, that is naturally the one that I am keeping in service, and the one that is more appropriate to this channel. So let's just take a moment on the backstory of this printer before we dive into the internals. In 1984, Commodore released the MPS-801 and MPS-802 printers for combining with the Commodore 64, and MPS, by the way, stands for Matrix Printer System, according to the C64 wiki. Although these were newly released printers, indeed, all that was actually new was the MPS branding and the case styling, as the MPS-801 was a restyled VIC-1525 and the 802 was a restyled 1526. In addition to the 801 and 802 in 1984, there was another brown-beige printer in the MPS-800 series, and that was the 803. That came about a year later, and we'll just leave that one to the side for now. The question is, what really was the difference for the average person looking at the 801 versus the 802? If you were a Commodore 64 user in 1984, you would have most probably purchased the MPS-801, which was Commodore's basic, vanilla, default printer. Indeed, any Commodore software that ever got written with print support, if it doesn't have drivers for multiple printers and just assumes that the printer works in one certain way, inevitably the printer it works with is the 1525/801, and we can lump the 803 in there as well, because when it finally came along, it worked the same as those other two. The 802 and its predecessor, the 1526, well, they worked a little bit differently, and we'll get to that in a moment. First, what were some of the functional differences between the 801 and the 802? Well, the 801 would only accept tractor feed paper with the little holes on the side that you pull off. The 802 encouraged tractor feed continuous paper, but was also equipped to friction feed individual sheets. The 801 would print at a speed of about 50 characters per second. The 802 was about 20% faster and would print 60 characters per second. The reason for this was that the 801 was a unidirectional printer, which means that the printhead would only actually print while moving to the right, then it would retract to the left, then it would print its next line while moving to the right. In contrast, the 802 is a bidirectional printer, which means it would print characters on the page both while the printhead was traveling to the right and on its way back to the left, thus giving you the extra speed. Finally, even though all the Commodore dot matrix printers had all of the Petsky character set letters and symbols available in their internal fonts, the 801's font did not have true descenders. The lack of true descenders and shifting all of the lowercase characters upwards to sit on the baseline alongside the capital letters was a cost-saving measure, as the printer then only needed 7 pins in its printhead, and this gives the text output by many retro printers a very unique look, which one may not immediately understand the reason for, but it becomes obvious as soon as you look at lowercase letters such as the lowercase p and q. This is, in fact, I suppose, why you have always been told to mind your p's and q's, and it seems that it becomes even more pertinent when we're talking about print cues. The MPS-802, having an 8-pin printhead and printing all of its characters on an 8x8 grid, of course had all of the correct descenders in its lowercase font, and the printhead itself was advertised to be of an excellent quality. The manual states that it's a heavy-duty printhead intended to last for the printing of about 50 million characters. So thus far, it sounds like the 802 is a clear winner, and indeed it is if you are specifically talking about printing quality text. The 802 excels at printing text and should in fact be regarded as a heavy-duty business machine. However, for the home user, the 802 does not have the same facility to print bitmap graphics as the 801. What the 802 gave you was a whole range of secondary commands which allowed you to format text according to columns and values and things that you would really want for business reporting, but weren't necessarily as useful to the home user. Because of the severe lack of bitmap functionality and thus severe lack of home software support, the MPS-802 often got a bad rap. To be clear, the 802 will happily print Petsky graphics all day, but the second that you have a program that wishes to print out a high-resolution screen, you are effectively dead in the water with this machine. There was one sort of solution in that the 802 allowed you to define a custom 8x8 character. No doubt this was intended for symbols the printer didn't have. Again, for business reporting, perhaps you wanted the Japanese yen symbol. Well, you could send that to the printer as a text character as part of your program. And of course, it was realized that you could therefore break down a bitmap into 8x8 squares and print the bitmap by printing it as one custom character at a time, but this was extremely slow and painful, and of course you would need a program that was specifically programmed for this printer in order to be able to do that. Just a quick sidebar before we dive into the internals, which I know you're all waiting for. If after watching this video you are interested in finding out more about the MPS-801, head over to N.B A's channel on YouTube and watch his video from March 24th, 2021. I'm happy to give him this shout out as I do not plan to cover the 801 on Basic Bytes. At some point, I would like to do a peek inside the MPS-803, which I personally far prefer. Unfortunately, my only 803 is out of service with a broken printhead. I'm not certain if those were unique to Commodore or a generic part that can be obtained elsewhere. If you happen to know, please leave me a comment. I suppose, in the meantime, I can also continue searching for the 803's optional tractor feed attachment, which was sold separately and seems to be more rare than the printer itself. And with that, let's get inside of her. So we're beginning with the bottom casing, which obviously is flipped upside down right now, these being the 4 rubber feet that the printer sits on, and this is mainly to call your attention to this little sticker here, which says shipping bolts with 2 arrows pointing to these vacant holes here. Now, if you have bolts in these 2 holes in your 802, remove them. With my 1526, I had the advantage of receiving all of the original documentation, including even the original warranty card, and with the manual, we received, as Commodore customers, this lovely cautionary insert. And number 2, remove the both shipping screws surface of the bottom case before setting the printer to use. Details are in your owner's manual. Well, of course, I also received the owner's manual, and I can tell you, having been through here, there is nothing about shipping screws in the section about setting up this printer. So I believe, looking at the grammar being used here, that this was not written by Commodore, but this was in fact provided by the Japanese factory that made the mechanisms that Commodore sourced to be put inside this printer. Commodore obviously felt that the little label saying shipping bolts on the bottom would be self-explanatory, and the only other little piece of interest down here is this little stamp into the plastic, which I doubt you can read on camera, and I can barely read sitting in front of it, which says, disconnect from power supply before servicing. Because, of course, when you're looking for a dire safety warning, where are you going to be looking for it but on the bottom of the case in a 4-point font? Thanks, Commodore. Anyhow, with that, it's time to flip her over. And here we have the interior of the bottom shell, rather exciting, I know, but one of the great things about this printer design is that everything unscrews and simply lifts out in a rather straightforward way in the event that you have an old dusty one and you need to give the shells a good cleaning. The only other real thing of note here is that where you see 2 of these standoffs in this case, the 1526 has a third one identical to these right about here. And indeed, the motor assembly in the 1526 has 3 shoulder bolts connecting it to the bottom case. So now we have put in the metal tray, for lack of better words, into the upper half of the case, which has the main power transformer and also holds in the main circuit board, which of course is not in here right now. It secures into the case simply with 3 screws with washers that are around this transformer here. On this side, there are simply these 2 plastic clips, and when inserting and removing, make sure that you properly slide this over the clips so as not to break them. And then on the right-hand side, you have the on-off switch, which simply drops into its slot. However, you should generally not need to remove this unless you are giving the shells a complete cleaning. And the one thing that is very prominent, of course, on this layer is the main power transformer, and this is where I give my safety warning slightly more prominent than the one Commodore put on the bottom of this case, and that is, this is the high voltage section of this device. Coming into this transformer, you have the full 120 volts AC from your wall outlet. So, by way of safety, do not open or work on equipment such as this unless, number 1, you know what you're doing, number 2, the thing is off, number 3, the thing is unplugged, and number 4, if you are not of the age of majority, that you are doing so under adult supervision. Although that last one is actually for my safety. That way, if anything goes wrong, you can simply blame the adult in the room instead of suing me. All right. And next up is the main board, which I do not have in the printer presently because I do not want the sides of that metal shielding to obstruct your view. There are a number of interesting things on this board that I would like to point out and explain, keeping in mind that I am aiming this channel towards the general user interest and endeavoring not to get too far lost in the technical weeds. If you are the techie type and want to know absolutely anything about the circuit, logic, or theory of this board's operation, then after you're done watching this video, just download a copy of the 802 service manual. It explains all of that in excellent detail. One thing by way of warning right off the start, do not turn this little R39 variable resistor unless you are a technician and have looked up in the service manual exactly what that does and you think it needs adjustment for some reason. What it actually does is fine-tune the timing of one of the circuits on this board that needs an exact 500 millisecond cycle, and you may cause your printer to not function correctly if it is set incorrectly. So unless you are doing maintenance at a technician's level, just leave that wherever the factory set it. Also, along the lines of maintenance and future-proofing, I will mention that I have just finished replacing all 6 of the electrolytic capacitors on this board. Now, recapping is not for everyone, but I personally, through my own experience, have become a big believer in replacing the electrolytic capacitors on any piece of technology that is more than 30 years old, as all of the Commodore hardware now is. 30 years being twice the 15-year anticipated lifespan of an electrolytic capacitor. I have seen so many weird and intermittent issues solved by recapping, which aren't necessarily on the level of an outright failure, but become apparent as having been a capacitor fault once the capacitors have been replaced. And as far as the printer goes, I will simply mention that if you have a printer that works intermittently, it kind of does, but occasionally it doesn't, and it kind of struggles. If it's not a mechanical fault of some kind, it could very well be that some of these capacitors that are on your main board, especially ones that are meant to help drive the DC motors, simply no longer have the, shall I say, elasticity of charging and discharging that they did in their youth. And that is worth checking out as the potential source of that sort of a problem. And finally, I would just like to briefly point out the functions of each of these 5 MOS branded integrated circuits, MOS meaning made specifically by Commodore. The first two are 6532s dated mid to late 1983. The MOS 6532 is a RAM I/O timer chip, and yes, that acronym does indeed spell riot, although I don't find those to be particularly funny. Next up is an MOS 6522 from mid-1984. The 6522 is a VIA chip, Versatile Interface Adapter. It is simply an older but similar concept chip to the CIA chips that are in your Commodore 64 and 128, which handle things such as keyboard and joystick port I/O. The next chip up gets quite a bit more interesting. Dated from mid-1984, this is the main 6504 microprocessor. Now, for those of you who are immediately thinking, hold on, 6504, is that a derivative of the 6502 microprocessor? And the answer is yes, it is, but unlike the 6502 derivatives that are inside your Commodore 64s, which are full 40-pin packages like these longer chips, you'll notice that this 6504 is only a 28-pin chip. Effectively, it is a crippled 6502. Now, internally, it can still do 64K of addressing. However, the chip itself cannot physically address 64K of RAM or ROM because a bunch of the address lines, as well as other functionality, has simply been physically removed from the pinouts on the chip. The 6504, I believe, has an internally compatible instruction set to the 6502. However, this microprocessor, which nonetheless runs at 1 megahertz, the same speed as the processor in your Commodore 64, because of its reduced pin count, can only actually address 8 kilobytes of RAM or ROM. And that brings me to this guy right here, which is the 8 kilobyte ROM chip that provides all of the operating system code for this printer and is the source of so much of the weirdness and confusion that has surrounded the 802 and 1526 through its lifetime. The first point of weirdness is that it was indeterminate whether this slot was going to have a 24 or 28-pin chip, and thus this is actually a 24-pin chip in a 28-pin slot, and there are several jumpers on the board which need to be bridged or cut depending on whether you have a 28 or 24-pin ROM in this slot. Moreover, it is actually quite rare to see an MOS chip in this slot. I believe that I have one because this was made in the later days in 1984, after the MPS-802 had been introduced and had been out for a little bit, and the ROM had finally stabilized into exactly what Commodore had settled on. But typically, what you see in this slot, regardless of whether it's a 1526 or an 802, is a generic EEPROM which has been burned with some revision of the ROM code that was released with this printer. There's a great company from back in the day, Abacus Software. I absolutely admire their work. They wrote so many great technical pieces of software and publications in the early days of the Commodore 64. And they have a book called The Printer Book for the Commodore 64 and VIC-20. And in that book, Abacus talks about why the 1526 is one of the most confusing printers ever released. Now, this ROM chip on here is revision 07C, and I believe that 7C was the last official ROM release for the 802. My 1526 has an EEPROM with a handwritten label that says 7B, so it must be one of the later 1526s that the operating system on it is still version 7. Well, according to Abacus, the earliest versions of the 1526 operated nothing like what the manual specified, but actually operated more like the 1525 printer. I don't know if that meant that it did bitmap graphics out of the box and that later that functionality was completely done in for its various business form formatting functionality that's on this ROM, but if you do buy an 802 versus a 1526, of course, because the 802 came out a year later, there is more of a certainty that you are going to get the version 7 ROM and probably, but not definitely, the version 7C, which, again, I believe is the last one ever officially released, although there were other aftermarket ROMs that I believe were released in Germany to give the printer functionality that the users there wanted but wasn't being delivered by the Commodore ROM, and, well, you can see why such a mess stemmed from that one particular chip when you don't exactly know whether or not your printer is going to function according to the manual or according to the printer of the supposedly exact same model that is sitting right beside it. Well, regardless of ROM revision and any confusion surrounding it, our mainboard is now back in the case. All 6 screws have been screwed into the standoffs surrounding it. Fresh thermal grease has been applied to the bottom of the aluminium heatsink, which connects to the main metal chassis down here with 3 screws. And, of course, our main power connector has been reconnected to the mainboard in its original factory orientation. And next, we move on to taking a look at the mechanical guts of this thing. Now, this is what I will call the mechanical assembly because it basically has every one of the 802's moving parts on it. You've got your tractor feed mechanism, your print head, your platens, your rollers, all of your gears. You've got your paper feed motor right here, and you've got your print head motor right there. Generally, even if you're disassembling your printer to give it a thorough cleaning and refreshing as we are doing, unless there is something really mechanically wrong in here, there is absolutely no need to disassemble this part of the printer any further. In fact, I would discourage you from doing so. If the need does arise, consult the service manual. It has extensive diagrams on how to take this whole assembly apart right down to every last gear and sprocket. But for purposes of simple cleaning up and cleaning out, it can remain completely intact. Even the rubber platens and rollers can, with some care, be cleaned in place, and that's the tact I highly recommend you take unless circumstances necessitate otherwise. First, I'll talk about general maintenance and cleaning, and for general maintenance and cleaning, that means you have a clean working printer and you just want to keep it in that condition. For that, you generally do not need to remove this from the printer case whatsoever. For general maintenance, all you need to do is use soft, dry brushes and cloths to make sure that the mechanism generally stays free of dust and debris. And also, on some regular basis, you want to lubricate these 2 metal rods on which the print head moves back and forth, and it is safe to gently move the print head by hand when you do so. This printer can be approached much like a sewing machine when it comes to maintenance, where regardless of how often you actually use the unit, oil does tend to dry out over time, so a reasonable rotation would be perhaps once a year. Make sure that you've cleaned and re-lubricated the 2 metal rails. Speaking of that, the service manual does say to use a good quality light oil to do so, and I find that a good quality sewing machine oil is the ideal thing for these 2 metal rails in specific. Users are also advised not to use any sort of solvents to clean out the printer mechanism, but simply to use clean, dry cloths and brushes. I generally agree with that advice because there are numerous plastic parts in and amongst this machinery, and of course, various solvents can damage or destroy various plastics. However, for purposes of these two rails, I think it's quite fine to use a cotton-tipped applicator with some 90% plus isopropyl alcohol on it to gently clean the old oil off the metal rails before you similarly put some fresh oil on a new cotton-tipped applicator and use that to brush lightly a few drops of new oil onto the rails. In all cases, though, do not spray anything directly into the printer. Always apply your alcohol or your oil or whatever you're using onto the applicator and then use the applicator to clean directly the surface that you wish to clean. Of course, today we are going beyond general maintenance and giving a decades-old printer that has been sitting who knows where a thorough cleaning. And if you wish to do the same to one of these units, there are a few things that you may wish to do to this assembly while it is removed. In terms of cleaning the platens and rollers, first of all, flip up these pressure rollers, and all you really need to do is take a clean, dry cloth, move the head to one side, use the cloth to clean back and forth as you rotate these plastic gears back here to rotate the platen, and when you have one half cleaned up, move the head over to the other side and do the same for the other half of the platen. Furthermore, take some cotton-tipped applicators, and underneath here there are 3 rubber rollers that you'll see around the back, and these are in fact pressure rollers that are flipped up and down by the friction or tractor feed switch, and this switch works much the same as the switch on your typewriter that raises and rolls the pressure rollers for when you're feeding in the paper or pulling it out. So similarly, all you need is a dry cotton-tipped applicator against those rollers as you rotate the platen underneath here, and if they are flipped up against the platen, then the platen will turn the rollers and you can clean them all the way around. If you want or feel the need to give the platen and rollers a more thorough cleaning than a clean dry cloth can provide, I do not recommend using alcohol or solvents on them simply because that tends to dry out the rubber, which is the opposite of the effect that you want. In theory, you can use isopropyl alcohol on platens once in a blue moon and they shouldn't take any damage. Nonetheless, I don't. What I do, and what you may wish to do if you are comfortable using industrial strength chemicals, is the exact same process I just described, but with your cloth or cotton applicators dampened with MG Chemicals Rubber Renue. Not a sponsor. That would be nice, but no, this is just something that I use which works like magic to rejuvenate printer and old manual typewriter platens, keeping in mind that if the platen is so old and dried out that the rubber is beginning to crack, there is absolutely nothing it can do to save you. But thankfully, most printers, as of the modern era at least, are not so old that that is an issue. And of course, if you look into the Rubber Renue, please use it in a well-ventilated area while wearing gloves and read all applicable safety directions. But I give it very high praise for its ability to clean and rejuvenate platens and rollers of all sorts. Further to that, there are a series of plastic gears all around this mechanism which must be approached with caution in terms of what you put on them because, again, many sorts of solvents or oil-based products can, in fact, damage plastic, and you don't want something eating into the gears of your printer. However, for those, I specifically use MOLYKOTE EM30L. This is a synthetic white grease which is specifically approved for metal on metal, metal on plastic, and plastic on plastic lubrication. The reason I have it is because it is highly recommended for lubricating the rails of floppy disk drives, and since I have it, I take a bit and I dab it onto the various plastic gears that surround this assembly, thus making sure that they turn smoothly and are well lubricated, and that the plastic gears, which are in general somewhat delicate, aren't taking damage over time. And I will just briefly show this same assembly from the bottom before I reinstall it into the printer, because this comes back to the issue of those infamous shipping bolts. Normally, this is attached to the printer via 2 shoulder bolts in rubber grommets here and here for the MPS-802. If you have the 1526, there is a third grommet with a shoulder bolt here, which of course is not populated on this model. Those are the only parts that screw in. The backside has these 2 rubber sheaths that slot into the case, as well as these 2 sprung pieces of metal that need to be wedged in underneath that metal box assembly that holds the main PCB. So if you look at how this is secured into the printer itself, it's all buffered by rubber pieces or springs. So my hypothesis is that under normal operation, this is designed in order to expect and tolerate a certain amount of vibration, whereas if you put the shipping bolts in, they screw directly into the metal here and here, thus completely immobilizing this entire assembly, because, of course, vibration, even if it's part of the operating design, is not necessarily what you want when this thing is in a crate being dropped off the conveyor at Canada Post. And with that, we have reinstalled our newly cleaned and lubricated Shinwa Model 80. What? Yes, that's actually what this entire mechanical assembly is labeled, Shinwa Model 80, and it was probably used in, any number of Japanese printers commissioned by any number of companies such as Commodore. But 2 shoulder bolts fastened into rubber grommets in the front, the back rubber pieces and springs properly inserted, the cable reconnecting it to the mainboard in the same orientation with which it was originally installed, and very importantly, there's a ground wire back here that needs to be screwed to the metal chassis in order to provide grounding for this unit. And with 2 more screws, the top shielding above our mainboard is reinstalled, leaving a convenient hole for the connector that runs to the front LED and paper advance button, which can only be installed one way. With the front panel connector attached, the top cover can be reinstalled, but it's a bit of a trick as it needs to be shimmied forward into place. It cannot simply go on straight down. The side control knob then simply pushes onto the mechanism in the correct orientation. But wait, we haven't talked about ribbon cartridges yet, which are somewhat essential if we're going to put that rebuilt printer to the test. Here in front of you, you actually see 2 original Commodore cartridges. This upper one, which has the applied Commodore logo sticker, also has an instructional sticker that implies there was some sort of an exchange program going on, because it says exchange times for this cartridge and a number 1 has been circled. Whereas this bottom one, which actually has the Commodore logo stamped right into the mold, is the one that came with my MPS-802, and while it does have an instructional label, there is now no mention of any sort of an exchange program. The question is, from a supply standpoint, how do these stack up against the other options? Well, right off the top, the cartridges for the MPS-801, 802, and 803 all claim that they have a life of about 1.2 million characters, and at 80 characters per line, 6 lines per inch, and 10 printable inches on each sheet of letter size 8.5 by 11, you can do the math on that. However, what is the cost and availability of these cartridges in the modern day? Well, some good news and some bad news. I cannot actually confirm that these cartridges, as used by the 802, are actually still being manufactured. It's possible that they are, I just haven't been able to confirm that, whereas the ribbon cartridges used by the 801 and 803, at least for the moment, are still being mass-produced if you know where to search for them, because there are still some common dot matrix printers out there that take those form factors of cartridges. You may think that makes the 802 a dead loss, but actually no, it's not at all as bad as it sounds, because there were a whole list of printers back in the day that took these cartridges, and in fact, Zimmers has a whole list of exactly what those makes and models were that you can search for. Even though these are Commodore branded, Commodore didn't invent this cartridge form factor any more than the chinois mechanism that we saw in the printer. They simply licensed and branded according to their own needs. This is where we get into a very important and interesting technology difference between these cartridges for the 802 as opposed to the other ones for the 801 and 803. The 801 and 803 don't use the same form factor of cartridge, but they both use a cloth ink ribbon cartridge, which is not unlike the cloth ink ribbon that you put into your typewriter, except inside the cartridge there's a sponge with ink on it, so the cloth ribbon gets re-inked every time it goes around in its loop. However, with those cartridges, you almost need to buy new stock, because being liquid ink on cloth, once that cartridge is open to the air, it does have a shelf life where that ink starts drying out. In fact, even in the package, they supposedly have a shelf life of some number of years, which is why when you find an 801 or 803 with the original ribbon in it, generally the printout is very faint to non-existent, and the first thing you need to do for those is buy a new ribbon. Compare that to these original old stock cartridges for the 802, which still print crisp and dark and clear. Why? Because they don't use ink on a cloth ribbon. It may not show up readily on camera, but these actually use a plastic film ribbon, and I'm led to believe that the ink that is on this plastic film is in fact black carbon. I don't believe that carbon on plastic necessarily has any particular given shelf life. Again, think of your typewriter. Think of the carbon paper that you use to make duplicate copies on your typewriter. Well, how long does carbon paper last? What's its shelf life? Well, essentially its shelf life is until you use it. So if these plastic film ribbons with carbon on them are similar to what we would expect from carbon paper, that would explain why these original stock ribbons still have no problem printing out just as dark as the day they were manufactured. In terms of pricing, it is true from what I'm seeing online these days in general that these cartridges are costlier than the generic cartridges that one can still buy for the 801 or 803, but the pricing is still within an entirely reasonable range when you divide out the cost per page, even compared to what one would expect to pay when buying supplies for a modern printer, and especially when considering the amount of printing that one can expect to get out of one of these cartridges, given its extreme longevity in terms of shelf life. So with that, I think it's about time that we popped one of these into the 802 and gave her a test run. And there you have it, a restored, refurbished, rebuilt MPS-802 printer, and because I know you want to see it working for the remainder of this video, I shall remove the soundproof cover. And to be clear, those are Commodore's words, not mine. In the 802 service manual, the top cover is actually referred to as a soundproof cover, which anyone who's ever been around a dot matrix printer knows that while they do dampen the sound, there is absolutely nothing soundproof about them. For testing purposes, you want to make sure that the serial cable is not connected to this printer. If it is plugged into your Commodore 64 and the Commodore 64 is off, this printer will not fire up or respond until the Commodore 64 does. So with everything else done, let's turn her on. That is a great sign. That's exactly what that head is supposed to do upon successful startup, is move all the way to one side and back to the other, and I can tell you that just now that head moved with a great deal more confidence than it did previously, and that is either due to the replacement of the electrolytic capacitors or the various oiling and lubrication that was done, or a combination of both of those things. Okay, so I do have tractor feed paper, but since most people won't, friction feed is what we will go with for a test print. And just a small tip, if you ever get anything jammed around the main platen, all you need to do is remove these two small screws here, and this top metal plate cover will simply come right off, and you can clean it out. Another quick tip is that this little metal push switch here should, whenever possible, be kept towards the front of the printer. If you move it towards the back, that moves your print head closer to the platen, and although you're talking about fractional millimeters, the harder the pins are hitting the platen, the less the life of your print head is going to be. So we have this pushed to the front. To load the paper while I attempt to obstruct the camera as little as possible, you can flip up the tractor feed controls. You want the printer initially in the tractor position, which drops the pressure rollers away from the platen, and flip up the front rollers. At that point, the paper can be cleanly pushed through. You can align the tops straight, flip down these rollers, and put the printer back into friction position, and your paper is now loaded and ready for a test print. These may also go down. The paper will slide right through them. One particularly useful feature about the test print is it will actually print out right at the top what version ROM this printer has, and therefore if you're wondering what's in yours, it's not necessary to open it up to find out. To do a test print, first I will turn it off, and to get it to run the test print, you simply turn it on while holding down the paper advance button. I get rather frustrated seeing listings for Commodore printers online where the sellers say unable to test, assuming that they need a computer. If there isn't a switch on the printer itself that puts it into test mode, most Commodore printers will self-test if you simply give them power while holding down the paper advance. Are we ready? 3, 2, 1. Success! And that is the sound of every computer lab for the last quarter of the 20th century. If you found this informative or entertaining, please like and subscribe to Basic Bytes for more. Also, what do you think of the 802 now? Leave me a comment. I mean, just think of the possibilities of driving everyone you cohabitate with completely insane. Thank you for watching.
Good grief.